So our last video for topic 3 in module 2 is on sexual selection. We don't need to go into a lot of depth of sexual selection, but I just want you to know how it can impact evolution. And typically we think of sexual selection as sort of a subcategory of natural selection. So natural selection often focuses on survival of different individuals based on variation of a trait. So what we've been talking about a lot has been which individuals survive because they have more food than other individuals, or which individuals survive based on how obvious they are to predators, and the ones who are camouflaged survive more. So most of the examples we've been talking about are about survival. Ultimately, individuals who survive are more likely to reproduce, but sexual selection deals specifically with reproduction and not at all with survival. But the premises are the same. There are variations within a trait. Some individuals, those variations within the trait are heritable, so they can be passed down to offspring, and these different traits may make them individuals more likely to gain access to mates or to have more offspring. But they don't really have anything to do with survival. That's not what sexual selection is about. It's all about reproduction and getting mates. So in a second I'm going to show you guys this video from Cornell about birds of paradise, and it will explain some of these concepts. But sexual selection is responsible for the sexual dimorphism that we've seen between females and males. So here you have the quintessential example of peacock. The female is drably colored, she's pretty well camouflaged, and the male has this ridiculously ornate tail, which displays all of these different eye spots. It's very obvious. It's really cumbersome. It would be really bad in terms of natural selection. Predators would be able to find these males and be able to attack them really quickly. So sexual selection is a theory that Darwin put forth to explain how males can have these elaborate traits when they seem to go against everything he thought about natural selection, that it would make it more likely for them to be eaten by a predator, and therefore not pass on very many genes. But sexual selection explains that. There are two main types of sexual selection. One category of sexual selection is female mate choice. So like in this example right here, the female may be able to choose between many different males who are displaying like this, and so she's going to choose the male that is most attractive to her, and typically that will be the male with the most elaborate traits, so the largest tail or the most eye spots. So that's female mate choice. That is one way that males, for example, can gain more mates, is if they have these elaborate traits. There's also male-male competition, where males will fight with other males, and that will allow them, the winner, to gain access to females. So both of these, female mate choice and male-male competition, are both forms of sexual selection. So I'm going to set us up to watch a video that will explain some of these terms, how it leads to sexual dimorphism, and some other characteristics about sexual selection and natural selection.
Why do some birds spend time and energy frantically dancing? Why do some have oversized ornaments making it harder to fly and forage? How can this be natural selection? Well, natural selection isn't actually the competition to survive. It's the competition to pass on genes. The battle to breed generates a particular kind of selection called sexual selection. Sexual selection is about outcompeting, often out-attracting competitors to get more and better mates. And that's where the dancing and ornaments come in. To understand how sexual selection can make an animal like this, we need to simplify things. First, we'll show how natural selection favors some traits over others, and how that results in changes to a population. Then we'll show how sexual selection can change the same population in unexpected ways. Let's start with a representative, everyday bird from a small population living on an island. In every generation, due to recombination or mutation, some chicks are born with changes in their genes that cause them to grow up with traits that are a little different. Here are 3 hypothetical new traits that might appear: awkward, armored shield, and long bill. Let's take awkward first. Like most new traits, awkward isn't helpful. It's hard to get around and forage. A baby born with the awkward trait won't grow up as strong as other chicks and might even die before it has a chance to breed. So the genes that caused awkward don't make it into the next generation. Armored shield seems at first to be beneficial. This chick is totally safe from predators and it lives twice as long as everyone else. But suppose the shield gets in the way and makes it physically impossible to breed. Even though the individual survives to a ripe old age, the armored shield genes die off. Every once in a while, a new trait pops up that provides an advantage. Longbill allows this bird to eat fruit that was too hard to handle before, enabling it to access a nutritious and plentiful resource. He grows up stronger and is able to gather more food and help raise more young. These young, both male and female, inherit both the trait and the advantage. So everyone with long bill, generation after generation, is more successful until everyone on the island eventually has a long bill. What we've just examined is classic adaptation by natural selection, the process by which traits become more or less common depending on an individual's ability to survive and gather resources. So, what then is sexual selection? Sexual selection is the process by which traits become more or less common depending on an individual's ability to mate with more or better partners. To really understand how this works, let's revisit our island population, now full of long-billed birds. These new bills have improved their diet so much that it's easier to raise young. Females can raise chicks on their own, freeing up males for the mating game. And in this food-rich environment, sexual selection can become a more dominant evolutionary force. How food is distributed, whether it's clustered or dispersed, can have a dramatic effect on what kinds of traits will be favored by sexual selection. Let's look at 2 situations, one that leads to male-male competition and one that leads to female choice. First, male-male competition, which we'll demonstrate with the trait burly. When a primary food source, like fruit trees, are clustered, males can defend territories around them to gain exclusive access to the females who come there to eat. A male who is born burly is better able to defend a territory and will be able to mate with more females. Thus, burly males will have more offspring, and their genes will become more common. Each generation of males will get burlier and burlier to the point of impacting their survival. Females who mate with burly males benefit in 2 ways. They have access to the food they need, and their sons are more likely to be burly and successful. But females don't get burly since they were already the right size for survival, and there is no advantage for them to carry this extra weight. Natural selection and sexual selection are pushing females and males into very different forms. And this difference between the sexes is a telltale indicator of sexual selection at work. Now let's look at mate attraction, specifically female mate choice. This kind of selection happens most dramatically when bountiful resources like fruit are spread out and impossible for males to defend. Instead, males must try to attract females, convincing them that they are the best possible mates. A male who is born fancy might have an ornament that he uses to attract females. If the ornament works, and more females choose to mate with him, then the genes for fancy will be passed on. Fancy traits may be innately appealing to females, or they may reveal something about the male's underlying health. In either case, these genes give rise to fancy males and females who prefer mates with those particular genes. Each generation, males become more elaborate until the traits significantly decrease their chances of survival. And just like our first situation, the females don't change because natural selection still favors their camouflage coloration. To sum up, classic natural selection leads to adaptations for gathering resources and surviving. Sexual selection leads to adaptations for gathering mates and breeding. These two kinds of selection may seem different, but the mechanism behind them is actually the same: the competition to leave more copies of the genes in the next generation. Evolution is never ending, with recombination and mutation creating new traits every generation. Most of these will die out, but those traits that provide an advantage in the competition to breed inevitably become more common over time, sometimes transforming the drab into the magnificent.
So while that video didn't spend a lot of time talking about the three components of natural selection that we discussed earlier, I want you to think about how they met the same conditions, especially in the sexual selection example. So I want you to think about what kind of variation they were showing for the sexual selection example, how they were demonstrating that it was heritable, and then what was being selected and how that would result in changes in the next generation. I also want you to make sure you understand the push and pull that natural selection and sexual selection have against each other, that the males often are the female choice selection and the male versus male competition selection often are selecting for traits in males that are bad in terms of natural selection. So I want you to kind of understand this battle between natural and sexual selection, and also make sure that you can explain the three components or requirements of natural selection in a sexual selection example. That's the last video for this topic, and I will see you again for the last topic of this module, which is community ecology.